Hello again, Netrunner fans. Willingdon here, and today I'm bringing you a review of the final pack in the lunar cycle. This one's called The Source, and there's a lot of really interesting stuff going on here. We're going to start by looking at the corporation cards. Really quickly, before I get started, I wanted to mention that in my last data pack review, I asked you guys to submit your feedback on whether or not I was going to read the cards as part of the review, or if I should just do the analysis. And a lot of people voted. I was really surprised. It seems like the majority want me to continue to read the cards. So that's what I'm going to do. If you have an opinion about this that you haven't voiced yet, go ahead and leave it in the comments to this video, and we'll go from there. First up, we have a Wayland agenda. This is Helium-3 deposit. It's 4 to advance and 2 to score. When you score Helium-3 deposit, place up to 2 power counters on a card with at least 1 power counter on it. So the obvious reaction I have to this card is that it's highly contingent on playing other cards that use power counters to be effective. Now, there are quite a few of those as the corporation. The first thing that immediately came to my mind are the variety of ice that use power counters. We've got kind of 2 types there. There are ice that have charges that you somehow gain, usually through like a trace, and then you can use those to some effect. So we're talking about things like Data Raven or like the Victor 2.0, things like that. I think Victor 2.0 is probably the most powerful of this type of ice, just because removing the counter does a brain damage, and all you have to do to get the initial counter is win a trace. Seems like it's not that hard to do. Snoop is fairly similar, except the hosted power counter instead lets you look at the runner's grip and pick a card that gets trash. Both of these effects I think are pretty good. There are quite a few other ice that have charge-based effects. The other type of ice that uses power counters are things like Draco. These are ice that are stronger because of the number of power counters we have. Right now there's just Draco. I think it's conceivable in the future that we would see other cards that are power counter oriented, other ice that are power counter oriented. There's a card in this pack that's power counter driven that I think will have some potential in Wayland, so when we get to that I'll bring up this agenda again. But right now there aren't a whole lot of non-ice that utilize power counters. If you remember, I believe it was in the last pack, or no, it was 2 packs ago, we had Docklands Crackdown, which is an asset where you can click it to put power counters on it, and then it's more expensive to install the first card every turn for the runner based on the power counters on it. Now, if you had a way to defend that asset and you could charge it up, it could be really expensive for the runner. I would say the same thing about a card that's later in this pack as well. So I do think that this agenda might have some potential, but it's a 4 for 2. It's going to be pretty hard to use. You're going to have some very specific ideas with this if you're going to put it in your deck. And I think Wayland has some pretty decent competing agendas. And they're right around the corner from getting a big box, which will presumably have more agendas as well. So, interesting card, not immediately jumping all over this one. Next up, we have another Wayland card. This is Errand Boy. It's a Sentry, 4 to res with 1 strength, and it's only 1 influence. Has 3 subroutines, and they're all the same. They are the Corp gains a credit or draws a card. Well, my immediate comparison was to Shadow, which is a fairly similar piece of ice. Shadow's just going to give you 2 credits instead of this kind of choice. Doesn't draw you any cards, but does have that subroutine where you can trace them for a tag. Plus, Shadow, being advanceable, can be protected against Parasite or Atman or some other things a little easier than this. That said, if you have something good to do with the drawing a card aspect, I think this ice is fairly unparalleled. There aren't a whole lot of ice in the game that let you draw cards, let alone let you draw 3 cards as a result of the runner encountering it. And this is going to be reasonably expensive to break when you compare it with Shadow. So I think that this card could potentially be good, but I think it's really going to be contingent on you being able to utilize the card draw and not exclusively the credit aspect. I think if you just wanted a piece of ice that was kind of expensive to break and you got some credits when you encountered it, I think most of the time Shadow is going to be better at that. 1 cheaper to res, you only gain 2 instead of 3 credits, but it has that advanceable thing, and if you can't do something with tags, then, we're talking about Wayland here. So I think that this card has a role, probably outside of Wayland, maybe in Wayland, but the drawing a card thing is what's really appealing to me about this piece of ice. Next up, we have the card that I was just talking about a minute ago. This is a Haas Bioroid asset called IT Department. It's 2 to res, 4 to trash, and it's 1 influence. It has click, place a power counter on it, and then you can remove a power counter to choose a res piece of ice. That ice gets +1 strength until the end of the turn for each power counter, including the one you spent, on IT Department. Let me first go through why I think this card is good, and then I want to talk a little bit about some of the weaknesses. First of all, until the end of the turn is pretty strong. Most abilities only work until the end of the run if they're abilities that you're likely to use during a run. This can be used at any time, not only during a run, and it lasts until the end of the turn. So, if the runner is trying to run a particular server multiple times in a turn, that added strength that you get from IT Department is going to last for all of the runs made that turn. Also, the fact that the power counter that you remove, the one you have to spend, is counted, makes this quite a bit better. You can use it in a lower power counter scenario a lot more often if you get that extra 1, including the one you spent. Probably the most significant thing about this card, though, is the fact that you can use its ability multiple times on the same piece of ice to give one particular piece of ice some absolutely ridiculous amount of strength. If we just consider, that we have 5 power counters on this thing, which, is a huge amount of investment, but I don't think is inconceivable, especially if you were using it in Wayland with the agenda we looked at earlier in this pack, the helium-3 deposits. So if you had 5, you'd be able to give a piece of ice +5 strength with the first counter, and then +4 with the next counter. That's 9 strength just for 2 counters, and then you still have 3 counters left. That's pretty good. So the ability to just give a single piece of any rezzed ice some incredibly large amount of strength is really, I think, the best part about IT Department. And I've talked in the past, I think in reference to hostile infrastructure as well as city surveillance, that I really like assets that function similar or kind of with ice. They're defensive assets, but they are not, ice. I think the game has had most of the defensive cards be ice so far, and I like the idea of having more and more options to defend yourself with non-ice cards. And I think IT Department fills that role nicely. That said, the fact that this is an asset is going to be a huge weakness. You're going to have to put this into a server where the runner can't get in and just trash it. If you've put a lot of power counters on it and you've built it up and you're trying to get that hot play off with it, you might have to use its counters to defend itself. I see this being a pretty difficult card to use in most decks just because it's an asset that needs to stay in play for a long time to be effective. And given the popularity of icebreakers like Femme Fatale and David, this has some very popular answers that are going to sort of make me consider it less, but this card has a really high power level, and I think that it's certainly going to be playable. 1 influence is really nice. The 4 trash cost is going to make it survive R&D. I think this is a lot better than Corporate Troubleshooter, which might be a card that you would compare it to. So, yeah, I think this card's pretty good. I really would like to see some people do some good stuff with this thing. Next up, we have another HB card. This is a piece of ice. It's a barrier and it's a Bioroid. It's Marcus 1.0. 4 to res, 3 strength, and 1 influence. It has the runner may spend a click to break any subroutine on it, and then it has 2 subroutines. The runner trashes one of his or her installed cards and end the run. So the immediate comparison that this ice has is to probably the best piece of ice in the game, and that's Eli 1.0. This is certainly not as good as Eli 1.0, but I do think that this is still going to be playable. So let me go through why I don't think it's as good as Eli, and then I'll talk a bit about why I still think it's going to be playable. First of all, Eli is only 3 to res, and it has that 4 strength. That is just a better value. It's more expensive to break in the long term and is just better. The 2 end of the run subroutines on Eli, I think, are also pretty substantial because early in the game, when the runner doesn't have any installed cards, Marcus is going to be a lot easier to get through because they're not going to care about that first subroutine. So they're gonna be able to get through this with 1 click, as opposed to Eli, which is always going to take the 2 clicks. That said, Marcus, I think, fits with the Bioroid and kind of HB ice scheme pretty well. One thing that HB has always had some issues with is preventing the runner from just face-checking their ice. Just running their ice to make them res it. And as HB, it's easy to get kind of behind the credit curve because the runner knows that they can just run your ice and say, hey, you're going to have to res that end the run piece of ice if you don't want me to see your cards. And this is going to be a card where if they make that sort of face check line of play, you're going to be able to res it and get them for that first subroutine. So this is really nice as an anti-face check piece of ice. It's also reasonably expensive to break for the same reasons that we see Eli being expensive to break. It's got a fairly high strength, it's a barrier, and it's got 2 subroutines. So in the long term, this is going to be a pretty decent piece of taxing ice, and it's going to be kind of a nice anti-face checking ice. That said, I think if you're not playing something Bioroid oriented, you're going to have better barrier options. I think really I'm excited about trying this in Stronger Together just because it gets bigger and it fits the whole scheme of Stronger Together pretty well. So this is pretty good, not revolutionary, but I like the idea that we're getting another 1.0 Bioroid ice that is good and isn't something highly specialized or funky to use. Next up, we have a new Jinteki ID. This is Industrial Genomics. It is Growing Solutions. A 4515 like normal, a division identity. The trash cost of each card is increased by 1 for each face-down card in Archives. Well, it doesn't take a whole lot for me to get excited about a new Jinteki ID, especially when it's pretty decent. I think as long as this card had text, I'd probably be excited about it. And this is pretty funky and unusual, to say the least. I think this is the type of ID that's going to be really effective as a sort of taxing, glacier-y style of deck, where you're trying to slowly tax the runner to death. I think this deck is probably going to be best using damage as the taxation source. Mainly I say this because I think the gimmick you can do is protect your archives with Shock and maybe Shikyu and be able to make it really costly in terms of damage for the runner to access and thereby turn face up the archives cards. Probably my favorite thing about this card is that it works on all of your servers. So, like for example, if they access a snare in R&D, they're going to have to pay an additional trash cost. That might mean that the snare survives, and then maybe you could hit them with it again later down the road. This card, I think, has some potential. That said, if we're talking about the glacier-y styles of Jinteki, I think we've already got some really good IDs Particularly RP is really strong, and I actually think Tenon is pretty good as well. So we've already got plenty of IDs to toy around with this. I like that this one is doing something very different, but I really think that it's going to be easier to protect the remotes that are your economy in RP. Like Sundew, for example, is going to be a lot easier to protect in RP than it will be in this deck, I think. I would like to see somebody try to combine this ID with Power Shutdown as a way to trash their stuff and then also get some cards in the archives. I'm not exactly sure how you would get the cards in the archives otherwise, except maybe just overdrawing with something like Jackson. So this card is interesting. I think that there's things down the road that could make it better if there's ways to burn cards off your deck and whatnot. So I think I'm going to leave this in the box until we get some more stuff, but this is going to be an option to toy around with in the future. Next up, we have another Jinteki card. This is Turtlebacks. It's an asset, clone type, 2 to res, 4 to trash, 1 influence, has 1 ability which is gain a credit whenever you create a server. Well, I don't think this card is particularly good. It is kind of right up my alley. I like funky economy cards that are difficult to use but could potentially pay out really well. And I think Turtlebacks is the next in a line of these kind of strange economy cards that are based on having tons of servers. I would compare this, or at least use it with the diversified portfolio card, which gives you a credit for however many remotes you have. This seems like it would be pretty good with that. That said, 2 to res, 4 to trash, that's the same as Pad Campaign, and I think in a huge number of decks, that guaranteed 1 credit a turn would be a lot stronger, and there's already plenty of decks where Pad Campaign isn't good enough to play. So you're going to really have to be creating a lot of servers. If you get 1 or 2 of these res, 2 of them resed, hey, that seems pretty strong. You're creating servers, gaining 2 money. But I think it's going to be hard to get to that point, and you're going to really have to put this in a very specific deck. I think mass assets, maybe lots of agendas as well, could be pretty good. I don't know how much I like this card. I'll probably mess around with it a little bit, but it's certainly a card that you're going to have to build a deck around. Next up, we have the first NBN card in the pack, and that is Shoot the Moon. It's an operation double, 3 to play, it's 2 influence. As an additional cost to play it, spend a click because it's a double, and res a piece of ice for each tag the runner has, ignoring all costs. This is one of those cards that I look at it and I don't really even care if it's going to be good or not because it's just so cool to have a card like this in the game. I got really excited about Eliza's toy box, and I think this is another pretty nice and very, very cool way to res ice at no cost. I think it's going to be fairly narrow in the way that the toy box was as well, where, they're going to have to be tagged. You're going to have a bunch of unresed ice. It works a lot better with expensive ice. If you're resing a bunch of pop-up windows with this, that's not that exciting. But I do think that this card is not unplayable. I think that it's probably something that we're going to be considering. I've been thinking about it with a Blue Sun deck, mainly because the Blue Sun deck already plays giant ice that we're trying to cheat the cost of. And since we're Wayland, tagging them is both pretty easy to do and is something that we have other effects for. It's not going to just be Shoot the Moon. That's our quote-unquote tag punisher. So I think that this card is the type of thing that we might see people trying to play in real decks, but it's going to be just unbelievable for casual play. I'm probably going to build a deck with Shoot the Moon that isn't particularly serious, but it's going to be really cool. Mid-seasons them, they got a million tags, and then you res your whole board. I can't really say it gets any better than that as the corporation player. That sounds pretty cool. Next up, we have another NBN card. This is a piece of ice. It's called Troll. It's a sentry that's 1 to res, 3 strength, and 2 influence. When the runner encounters Troll, trace 2. If successful, the runner must lose a click or end the run. Even though we've seen a lot of ice that share text with this card, I do think that this is a somewhat revolutionary piece of ice. The main reason I say that is that it doesn't have subroutines. It only has this win encountered effect. And the win encounter effects are substantially harder to deal with because you can't just break them like you can a subroutine. This has been part of the reason why Toll Booth has been so nasty throughout the duration of the game. The only way you can really deal with these win and counter effects is to bypass the ice, and that's largely just femme fatale from an icebreaker's perspective. So you're going to be getting hit with this thing almost every time you encounter it. That's going to make it a lot better on R&D or a central server that they're going to run all the time. If you have a way to boost the trace, I think this card is fairly legitimate. The Trace 2 is going to be pretty easy to deal with for most runners, just because a lot of runners have a link, especially some of the most popular ones like Andy and Kate. So I think if you have free credits, say from Making News, this becomes a lot stronger. If you have other ways to boost the trace, this becomes a lot stronger. I think this is a decent taxing sort of thing. Making them lose that click is going to be a tax. And if you have a way to consistently win the trace, I think this card looks pretty legit. I will also put out there that the 3 strength is nice because it's going to make it a lot harder to just deal with it with Parasite. I think that's the way that I would be inclined to try to deal with a piece of ice like this. And Parasite, you're going to really need some like Data Sucker or some additional way to boost the Parasite unless you want to just sit around forever and wait till the counters ramp up to 3. Next up, we have another NBN card. This is another piece of ice. It's Virgo, and this is the last of the cycle that we've sort of saw fleshed out in the last pack. This is a Sentry Tracer that's 4 to res, 5 strength, and it's 2 influence. It has 1 subroutine, which is Trace 2. If successful, give the runner a tag, and if your trace strength is 5 or greater, give the runner a tag. As with the other ice of this type, an essential thing to understand is that if your trace strength is 5 or greater, they get the tag. It doesn't matter if they win the trace, right? So as long as you pump 3 into the trace, they're going to get at least 1 tag. They might get 2 tags if they don't beat the trace. That said, if they break the subroutine, doesn't matter, right? No trace occurs. 5 strength is going to make it pretty expensive to break that subroutine, but I think beating the trace is going to be fairly trivial for a lot of decks. Like with most of these other ice, I don't like the idea that you have to spend credits after the res. You're going to spend 4 to res, and then you're probably going to have to spend credits to boost that trace, especially if you want to get the trace strength up to 5 or greater and get kind of the core advantage out of this card. I do think this one's a little better than some of the other ones in the cycle, mainly because it's in NBN, which has Making News as one of its IDs. I think if you're playing this type of ice and Making News, it's a lot more legitimate because you have those free credits for doing traces. So this piece of ice, I think, works if you are heavily doing trace stuff, but if you're not heavily doing trace stuff, I think this is probably going to stay in the box. I think we have plenty of other good Sentry options. They might not be 5 strength, but I think they can be fairly comparable strength, and they're not going to be reliant on you maintaining them by boosting a trace later in the game. Next up, we have a neutral agenda. It's a 5 for 3 that's unique called Utopia Fragment. As an additional cost to steal an agenda, the runner must pay 2 credits for each advancement token on that agenda, and like with the other fragments, it is limit 1 per deck. As cool as this might initially seem, I think this is probably the weakest of the fragments. I really don't like the idea that in order for this card to work, you're going to have to score a 5-for-3 agenda. I've said that about a ton of other 5-for-3 agendas, but I think especially Hades Fragment has a much more long-term impact in the game than this does. This is pretty amazing if you score it as your first agenda. And it's especially nice if you're trying to score like an NAPD or something as your follow-up agendas, or even just another 5-for-3. You know, it's going to make your subsequent agendas easier to score. That said, you're going to have to score a 5-for-3 agenda to do that, nearly halfway to winning the game in order to accomplish that task. So, like with the other fragments, I think the real use for this card is going to be in decks that don't really have good 5-for-3 agendas, but are trying to play that kind of scoring setup. Immediately to my mind comes HB. Usually, we don't want to play Project Wotan. It kind of just sucks. And Utopia Fragment is going to be probably better than that if you need a 5-for-3 agenda that isn't priority requisition. So I like the idea of having more 5-for-3s in the game. I think this ability is strong, but it's just going to be so incredibly hard to use because of the fact that it's on a 5-for-3 that I think really the value of this card is going to be replacing the garbage 5-for-3s that you're trying to play in other decks, right? Like I think NBN might like this as well because they don't really have, you know, their 5-for-3 isn't that solid. I think HB is probably going to be the deck that I'm going to be trying, or the faction I'm going to be trying this in the most. Stronger Together might want to play something like this just because even in a Bioroid-focused deck, I think that Project Wotan is pretty weak. So maybe this could be better than Wotan in that deck. Pretty narrow use for this card, but I always get excited about 5-for-3 agendas, and having more neutral agendas in the game is going to be good, period. So I like this card. I just don't really think it's that good. Next up, we have another neutral card. This is a piece of ice. It's also unique, called Excalibur. It is Mythic Grail, 2 to res, 3 strength, 0 influence, has only one subroutine, which is the runner cannot make another run this turn. Quite a few things going on with this card. First of all, Grail doesn't cost influence. This is the first Grail piece of ice we've seen that doesn't cost influence. That's pretty nice. That said, it doesn't have the Grail ability. This would be infinitely stronger if it had the Grail ability to reveal 2 Grail ice. The main reason I say that is that the biggest disadvantage of the Grail ice is that they have very low strength. Only Merlin has like a legitimate amount of strength. So having a 3 strength piece of ice that you could attach subroutines to would be pretty good. This thing, you're going to be putting that subroutine on other pieces of ice. I could see that maybe being okay. I could even see it mattering in a non-Grail deck. Like putting this on a central server with RP would be kind of cool. They couldn't run your remotes. Or, you know, another deck that's trying to protect its remote servers or is forcing the runner to run on a particular server or things like that. I could see maybe this thing being pretty good just because it's hard to break and it has a fairly legitimate amount of strength and it's pretty cheap. But this is going to be a pretty narrow use card, and I'm curious to see what people come up with this thing. The last Corp card in the pack is another neutral upgrade, and I've been very excited about these in the past. This is Self-Destruct. It's 2 to res, 0 to trash, 0 influence as well. Install only in a remote server, and its only ability is Trash. Trash all cards installed in or protecting this server. And Trace X. If successful, do 3 net damage. X is the number of cards trashed. Use this ability only during a run on this server. Before I talk about whether or not this card is good, let me first make sure that we're clear on how this card works. mechanically how the rules work, you're not going to be able to score an agenda before you use this thing, right? Like if you have a agenda that's a 3 for 2, say, and you have 3 advancement counters, you can only score agendas on your own turn, on the Corp's turn. So you're not going to be able to score an agenda before they get in. The only type of thing that you would be able to do before self-destructing is use the ability of, say, another asset or upgrade. The biggest weakness of this card is use this ability only during a run on this server. Also, you can only put it in remotes. I think both of those things are severely limiting the playability of this card. This is really going to be the type of thing that you're going to have a very specific reason you're including it in your deck. There's no way you're going to want to just put this in an existing deck and not have a really clear and defined plan of how self-destruct is going to contribute. The best thing that I can come up with, and I've seen some people talk about this online, is using this with the executives that can be trashed and scored, like for example Director Haas or Chairman Hero. These are assets that when they are trashed by the runner, they are scored as an agenda worth points. That's a big liability, and I think has been a huge reason why those cards haven't been very popular. And self-destruct seems like a pretty good way to get that liability out of play while still punishing the runner. Now, I don't really think 3 net damage is that good. I really wish it was a higher amount, or it was like brain damage, or just had more of an impact. I think most of the time when you're doing that 3 net damage, it's not going to really matter that much. I could see this flatlining some runners, particularly in like a Jinteki, more glaciery deck that's using a lot of ice that does damage, but this seems really narrow to me, and if you've watched any of my data pack reviews before, you know that I absolutely hate cards that have low trash costs. Trash 0, sitting in your R&D, sounds like a pretty good way to never use this card. So, I don't know, maybe this is a cool card. I like the flavor of this card. I probably won't be playing this card. Well, that's going to do it for the Corp portion of this review. Please tune in to the next part where we're going to talk about the runner cards. There's a lot of cool stuff over there as well. Thank you for watching, and if you liked it, please click subscribe and the button that looks like a thumbs up, and I'll see you over at the next video.